Hello, everyone. As you might have already guessed, this week is going to be a fencing related story that happened to me. This happened in 2018 from the tournament that I earned my E in. So, a bit of background on me. I started fencing foil originally, and then after a couple years of that, went to a different club where they actually offered the other two weapons. The original club that I started in was very small, so they could only offer one. I eventually switched clubs, and this new club offered the other two. I started watching saber fencing, I started getting more and more interested in it, started taking a few classes, and eventually switched over entirely. Now, during this time, I had an E12 in foil, and to anyone who isn't familiar, there is a rating system in fencing. Basically, at certain tournaments, you can earn ratings depending on where you place. E is the lowest, and it goes all the way up to A. And it's also categorized by the year that you earn it. So, for example, an E12 is an E rating that was earned in the year 2012, and an E13 is one that was earned in 2013. The more recent the rating, the better. So, at the time, I had an E12, but I wasn't very competitive, so I hadn't been working on my foil very much. And then I got interested in saber, so I started working on it even less. For a while, I tried to juggle the two weapons, but eventually I switched over entirely to saber. About 2 years later, I think, about 2 years, this was a while ago, 2018 rolled around. And the thing is, if you don't earn new ratings, or at the very least earn the same rating that you already had, called renewing your rating, then your rating actually decays. It goes down every couple years by one letter. But since E is the lowest letter, when 2018 rolled around, my rating decayed entirely. I was back to a U, which means unrated. And the ratings do not transition across the three weapons. If you are rated in one weapon, that does not mean you are rated in another. They are different skill sets after all. So I still wanted a rating. A lot of people say don't really put stock in them, and I do agree with that, but I also like having a rating. But the thing was, I wasn't good enough at the time to actually earn my rating in Saber. So I decided to start competing in foil. I still had most of my foil equipment, and what I didn't have, like extra weapons, I could easily borrow from my club. And I still knew most of my foil skills. A few of them had suffered because they didn't apply to Saber, and in fact, some of them made me worse in Saber, so I had been working on unlearning them, but not enough time had gone by that I had completely forgotten them. So I started going to tournaments on the weekend, but still doing Saber practices during the week. The thing was, I still knew enough about foil to be fairly confident that I could earn my E rather quickly. And actually, I was right. I realized when I went into foil that the main problem I had from fencing saber was I kind of lost most of my point control. Everything else, though, I still had, and in fact, I was more aggressive than the average foilist, but not to such a degree that it hindered me all the time. So it was actually pretty nice. So I did have to go to a couple tournaments over the weekends to sort of bring my point control back up to an acceptable level. But eventually, I got to the point that it was something I could rely on. Now, the thing about me is that, especially when I did foil all the time, I had a couple tricks up my sleeves that I really liked using all the time. I'm not going to explain them too much if you've never fenced before, because it kind of goes into a lot of detail. But I remember there were two things that I was really particularly skilled in. One was absence of blade, and then quickly coming up to a very strong parry 6 and riposte, and the other was knowing the extreme edge of my range. And I'm not talking about how far I could lunge, I'm talking about how far I could lunge while fully pushing myself forward, torso leaning forward, throwing form out the window just to get an extra couple inches. It was something that I actually knew how to do. And along with a couple of other things, I was good enough to be able to spot the opportunity right when it presented itself. And the nice thing about knowing that range is that even though that kind of stretched out attack is difficult to recover from, it's nice to be able to know how to do because it usually means that you can attack from further away than your opponent expects. So a lot of times they don't even parry because they're just not expecting it at all. So if you could do it fast enough, it's a good weapon to have in your arsenal. So this story is mostly about my favorite bout from the tournament that I eventually earned my E18 in, and actually the bout that I had to win in order to earn it. This was a D and under event. So I was fencing this kid from my club, let's call him David. Now, David was a very skinny and very small fencer. This was before he hit his growth spurt, but he had been fencing for a while, so he was pretty good. And the thing is, foil has the smallest target area. So, a small kid, if they're particularly good, is a dangerous opponent because they don't have much target area and it's difficult to hit them. But the thing is, I had seen David fence other fencers at my club, and I had actually fenced him at one of the first tournaments that I started going to, trying to earn my E in. And I realized that he had a habit that was definitely not something that was done on purpose. It's difficult to describe exactly how I was able to tell, but basically I started to realize that he sort of leaned on the fact that people couldn't hit him very well. I saw him fence a lot of people who were pretty good foilists, and they just had a tough time trying to hit him. And in the bout that I had very early on against him, I had the same problem. It was very tough to hit him. Now the thing is, he wasn't particularly squirmy or anything like that. He didn't really jump around and try to actually avoid the touch. He was just so small that it just didn't really happen. It was a common enough occurrence to him that he just sort of took it in stride and sort of relied on that fact. But I don't think it was on purpose. So after a couple tournaments, my point control was sharpened to the point that I was actually able to hit him rather reliably. And what was kind of funny, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't very funny to him, but it was funny to me, especially in the moment, he started to, well, panic a little bit. He was getting hit far more often and far more consecutively than he was accustomed to. And I could tell in the later stages of the bout, he started to choose more desperate things that he just wasn't really accustomed to. I remember one example, he tried to do some sort of counterattack where he kind of turned to the side but also kind of jump up. I'm not entirely sure what he was trying to do. I think he might have been trying to do an incortada, but I'm really not sure. Because the thing is, that's how unrefined it was. He was trying to do something that he had clearly never done before, and I could tell it was because he was panicking, because he didn't know how to adapt to actually getting hit so often. And it also didn't help that during the bout, I kept using that absence of blade that I talked about before to actually get him. Now, I was kind of proud about how I could fence with absence of blade because basically, whenever I would have it down and try to trap someone into a 6, that seems like a long way for the blade to travel in a fast moving sport like foil. But the thing was, I had been doing it for so long that I was actually very good at it. I'd always had a strong parry 6, and someone told me that I should work on it to make it better, but also work on it so that I could get people to the point that I could use it against them instead of just waiting for the opportunity. I was given that advice years ago, so at this point I was pretty good at it. And the reason I was particularly proud of it was I could tell people would try to sort of get around it, but even if they knew that it was coming, even if it was a blatant setup to try to get them into a parry 6, I was good enough at it that half the time it didn't even matter if they saw it coming. It still worked. So David was sort of falling apart because he was getting hit often, but also because I was just taking his blade whether on defense or offense. I was very accustomed to just smacking it to get it out of the way, completely ignoring priority, just coming in. Because remember, it doesn't matter what the fencers are doing, and it doesn't matter how inexperienced the ref is, no one can argue a single light. Now, this is the part where my absence of blade fencing and the extreme edge of my range knowledge comes into play in the same moment. At one point, I was fencing at the very end of the strip. Because the thing is, David had managed to get the attack. He had priority and he was moving forward. But the thing was, he had been in this position quite often before, and it had never worked out for him. Because the thing is, while I could fence with Absence of Blade on the attack, I could do it even better on defense. So it really reminded me of a dog that had caught a car and just didn't know what to do with it after it stopped chasing it. David had the attack. I was on defense, I was backing up, but he just didn't know how to finish. Because every time that he had finished his attack before, I had just taken the blade, swept it aside, and come in for a riposte. So he was unsure what to do next. But basically, he was just pushing me very slightly, especially here because we were at the end of the strip. There wasn't a whole lot more that he could do. So he's just moving forward very slowly, just enough to keep the attack. And his blade was held very far back. Because, like I said, whenever I had Absence of Blade, I was quick enough that I could also take it with a beat if I was moving forward. So there have been plenty of times where I took the blade, even though it was in a situation that it probably is not ideal, and I would still manage to make it work for me. So even though he was pushing me back, his blade was cranked way far back. Like, it wasn't even as far back as a parry 6. It was like almost level with his shoulder because he just didn't want his blade to be taken again. And I realized that the downside to this is he left his torso wide open. Now, the problem is I couldn't just attack straight into it because if he finished on time, then he would get the point. Because, like I said, he had the attack, he already had priority. I couldn't do anything. So I backed up a little bit further and started judging the distance. Basically, what happened is I went back an inch and he came forward an inch. And I went back another inch and he came forward another inch. I go back an inch, he comes forward an inch and a half. And that was just enough to be able to tag him right in the middle of the chest, and it was done from far enough away, and especially since his blade was already way far back, enough time passed by that his finished attack did not arrive in time. Now, David had been flustered by many of what I had done earlier in the bout, but this was the first time that he was so frustrated he just let out a yell. He was confused about what was happening. He was pretty annoyed by how the events were going. He definitely put up a good fight, but it didn't matter in the end, especially since he was actually getting hit a lot and it became apparent that his defense had more holes in it than he originally realized. He started to really panic. Now, that's happened to me a few times, so it's hard to take any real joy from it because I've been in his position and it was not fun. But honestly, at the time, I kind of enjoyed having that sort of power because, even though it sounds mean, it's also a real affirmation of your abilities. The more frustrated your opponent is, then that must mean the better you are. So it's sort of nice to kind of look at what's happening and take it as a compliment that your opponent has no idea what to do against you. And that was basically how I earned my E. I came in second at that tournament because then I went on to the finals and I got absolutely destroyed by my opponent. But honestly, there's no grudges held there. I happened to know the guy. I knew he had been working very hard. I knew he had been making leaps and bounds during my absence. Because actually, believe it or not, this guy that I fenced in the finals, he had actually kind of looked up to me when I was fencing foil. I mean, you give someone one good piece of advice in a tournament, and all of a sudden they think you're just the greatest thing to happen. So he came along, he trashed me, and got his D. And honestly, he really deserved it. So good on him. But that's the end of my story. I just want to share with you guys one of my favorite fencing memories. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week. Bye.